Students, welcome to another Mr. Ness screencast. Today's aim is the election of 2000. And here are your objectives. Pause the video, look these questions over, and get ready to copy some vocab terms and take some notes. In the very controversial election of 2000, Republican candidate George W. Bush defeated Democratic candidate Al Gore. George W. Bush was the son of previous President George H.W. Bush. He had been president in the 1980s and 1990s, and you might remember George H.W. Bush from the Gulf War. And at the time of the election in 2000, Al Gore was the vice president of then incumbent President Bill Clinton. Now let's talk about how presidential elections in the U.S. work. The United States has a unique process for electing presidents called the Electoral College. The Electoral College involves two different but related sets of votes. The first is called the popular vote, and the second is called the electoral vote. The popular vote is the vote that is cast by the general public. In other words, it's the total number of citizens throughout the entire country who vote for a certain candidate. In the popular vote for the election of 2000, Al Gore received a little more than 51 million total votes, and George W. Bush received a little less than 51 million votes. So Gore won the popular vote. About 600,000 more people around the U.S. voted for Gore than they did for Bush. But this election was really close. With 100 million votes cast, 600,000 was a small margin of victory. And even though more people voted for Gore, he could not yet declare victory because he had not won enough of the electoral votes that are required to win the election. Electoral votes are votes cast by special people called electors, who are members of the Electoral College. And these votes are the ones that ultimately determine the winner of the presidential election. There are 535 electors, or electoral votes, and they're divided up among the different states in the country based on each state's population. States with more people living in them, like New York or Texas, have more electoral votes, and states with few people, like Delaware or Wyoming, only get a few electoral votes. To win the presidency, a candidate needs to win at least 270 electoral votes. Now, we're going to combine the two types of voting we just talked about, the popular vote and the electoral vote. And here's the key thing you need to know. The candidate that wins the most popular votes in a specific state wins all of that state's electoral votes. And this system is called winner-take-all. Let's look at New York State. Look over here. In 2000, New York State had a population of about 20 million people, and it had 33 electoral votes. About 4 million people in New York State voted for Al Gore, and 2.5 million voted for Bush. And since Gore got more of the popular vote in New York, he won all 33 of New York's electoral votes. And that means that even though 2.5 million New Yorkers voted for Bush, Bush didn't win a single electoral vote in New York. Gore got all of them. Now let's look at Texas down here, where the opposite happened. In Texas, about 4 million people voted for Bush, and about 2.5 million voted for Gore. So in Texas, Bush won the popular vote. And as a result, he won all 32 of Texas's electoral votes. Gore didn't get any of them. The winner-take-all system means that in some situations, a candidate could win the popular vote overall in the country, but still get fewer electoral votes and therefore lose the election. And that is exactly what happened in the election of 2000, and it also happened more recently in the election of 2016. But the story of 2000 gets more complicated. Because the election was so close, there were some states where it was not immediately clear who had won the state's popular vote. And one of these states, Florida, had so many electoral votes up for grabs that the winner of that state's popular vote would automatically win the election. So Florida ended up being really important. And to be sure who had won the popular vote in Florida, the government called for a machine recount of all the votes in that state. The machine recount showed that Bush was ahead, but there were problems with the machinery that made it difficult to say for sure. There was confusion over the counting of something called hanging chads. These were punch card ballots that were not completely punched and may have been miscounted by machines. Lawyers for Al Gore went to court to request a manual recount by hand of all the votes in Florida. But then George W. Bush's lawyers appealed, and the case went to the Supreme Court. In the resulting case, Bush versus Gore, the U.S. Supreme Court ordered that the recount in Florida be stopped. And they declared Bush the winner of Florida's electoral votes and therefore the winner of the 2000 election. Bush won and Gore lost. This was the first time in U.S. history that a presidential election had been decided by the Supreme Court. And this was incredibly controversial for several reasons. One was that people felt that it was undemocratic for the Supreme Court to decide a presidential election. Over 100 million people had voted, but in the end, the president was determined by just 9 people, the Supreme Court justices. Another reason was that the Supreme Court's 5-4 vote was along partisan lines, which means that the justices who had been appointed by Republican presidents in the past ended up ruling in favor of Bush, the Republican, and the justices on the Supreme Court who had been appointed by Democratic presidents in the past ruled in favor of Gore, the Democrat. So people felt that each Supreme Court justice was actually just supporting the candidate that they liked. All right, it's time to review the objectives. If you don't know the answer to any of it, rewind the video and look again. See you in class. Bye, students.